1888. Jack the Ripper. This coin was circulating at the time of the infamous Whitechapel murders in London, England. Jack the Ripper. Resolution from Hell. An inquiry into who the real Saucy Jack was. Jack the Ripper. One inspector said it was a one Montague John Druitt, who was supposedly a sexually insane maniac who allegedly committed suicide or was found in the Thames River shortly after the last Whitechapel Jack the Ripper murder. His own family believed him to be the Ripper. But is he a prime suspect? Or possibly James Maybrick? In a time in the 19th century when prostitution was rampant and syphilis infested everything and everyone, could it have driven many people to insanity, to homicidal maniac murder? There was a diary supposedly found of James Maybrick, and he confessed. But then the people that found it, of course, they all met in a pub. They claimed it was fraud, that they faked it. They wrote the diary themselves. Prince Albert, Prince Eddie, the Royal Conspiracy, the Masons. I believe it's Mr. Knight goes into depth on a royal conspiracy to hide a secret wedding to a Catholic, all the way to a secret love child between Prince Eddie and a prostitute. It's stretching it. Then we have Francis Craig. Suppose that I guess he was a journalist, and since some of the Jack the Ripper letters were sent to a wire service instead of a main national newspaper, apparently they say this guy killed all the other prostitutes in order to get to what was supposedly his wife who left him, Mary Kelly, and then just butchered her and murdered her in a frenzy. I do believe her murder was possibly by someone who knew her or cared for her at one time, due to the enormous brutality and horrendous way in which she was mutilated and murdered. Could it have been her one-time boyfriend, one Joseph Barnett, who was a fishmonger? The theory goes he lost his job and was unable to support Mary Kelly, and he felt bad about that, but she turned to prostitution, which he could not stand, which did that drive him to a horrendous, crazed murder of her. They say online on the internet that he murdered all the other prostitutes, the other 4 or 5, to scare her away from prostitution. That's quite a theory, to kill 5 other women, 4 or 5 other women or more, just to scare the girl you love not to be a prostitute. But I guess stranger things have happened. James Kelly is another prime suspect. He supposedly, allegedly contracted syphilis from a prostitute. He was a heavy drinker and had problems with his wife. He eventually married, and he stabbed her in the neck, I believe, and killed her. And just before he was going to be put in the hangman's noose, he got a reprieve and was sentenced to an insane asylum, where after a short time, he and another man made their own personal keys from the keys of the guards by watching them closely, and escaped into the world. And he came back something 20, 30 years later, after apparently traveling from England and all over the United States and back. And he came back and turned himself in at the insane asylum and said he was on the warpath. A lot of people take that to mean he was killing prostitutes and everything else. Then quite interesting. Then there's the theory of the Queen's personal physician, Sir William Gall, who was on a some kind of murderous rampage due to the stories about Prince Eddie dealing with prostitutes and who knows what. It seems like a lot of hearsay, a lot of different stories. And then we have H.H. Holmes, the first American serial killer in Chicago, and he was doing insurance scams, killing everyone to collect insurance money, built a murder castle. This guy is an absolute lunatic. He said he was born from the devil. The devil was there when he came into the world. Some people think he was Jack the Ripper. he was crazy enough. He if the timeline was right, it's possible, but there are still several others. We have one, Trevor Marriott, a murder squad retired detective, wrote a book, a novel, that it was a Carl Fagenbaum, a German merchant marine sailor who was later executed in New York's Sing Sing prison for cutting the throat of a landlady and possibly trying to rob her money. And he apparently told his attorney he felt the need at times around women to an uncontrollable need to mutilate and murder. And but there are several discrepancies with his attorney, and that Carl or Zahn Fagenbaum, but that his attorney lied possibly in the story. So I always thought maybe more needed to be learned about Fagenbaum's brother, possibly. In Ed Norris's book, he's the one he names James Kelly. He's a Ed Norris retired New York detective, among other things. And this guy, Francis Tumblety, who apparently had always been a dirty, strange scoundrel, claimed he was an Indian medicine selling doctor. Then he hated women and supposedly had a collection of women's uteruses and other things preserved in jars in his house. And he did have medical knowledge as he worked part-time at a hospital when he was younger in a coroner's office. And there's instances he claims he extreme hate for women due to he fell in love with a woman who he later found out was a prostitute, or she became a prostitute, and I believe she disappeared too. I'm not sure about that, but I believe he is one of your top 2 prime suspects. Scotland Yard was after him for, I guess, some homosexual behavior in London or around that area, and somehow he made bail and escaped, and he evaded all of them, and they believed he was a suspect for the Ripper murders, but as he evaded capture and got back to New York, where, mind you, also another Jack the Ripper type murder was committed to a prostitute that went by the name of Shakespeare, because she used to recite Shakespeare's plays and poetry when she was drunk or carrying out her business. He had plenty of money, and I wondered if it never says where he got all his money, and I wondered almost if him and H.H. Holmes knew each other somehow and were dealing in medical cadavers, selling body parts, medical procedures. That would be interesting to find out more about that and where he actually accumulated his wealth. He may have got it from a drugstore he worked in or owned, or supposedly he died a wealthy man, and he was the prime suspect by Scotland Yard or the Metropolitan London Police as Jack the Ripper. And nothing ever happened because they kind of shot themselves in the foot because they couldn't extradite him from America on charges of, I don't know what you would call it, homosexuality, which was illegal back then. And you could be imprisoned or worse for that sort of behavior. Another theory by, I believe, one of the Scotland Yard theories was a wife of a Dr. Sir John Williams, who was barren. I guess she couldn't have children. And possibly the good doctor, had affairs with prostitutes. But this, I guess her name is Lizzie Williams, that possibly she would kill these women and mutilate them. I feel more consistent it was a man. I feel the women were instantly overpowered. Not that a woman couldn't do it if they catch them by surprise. But once again, this Francis Tumblety, he was a big man. I believe they said over 6'4", maybe something. Big guy. And he used to wear a military outfit and parade around. At one time, he would ride a white horse led by greyhound dogs through the streets of Boston. This guy was really something else. Really colorful character, whether he did it or not. But he definitely had medical training. I'm leaning towards someone with some kind of medical training. Because with some of the murders, it just seems. But then again, some of them were so full of hatred, it seemed, that the mutilation, or maybe it was cold, calculating, just murder. And then, of course, we have Patricia Cornwell, who swears Walter Sickert, 19th century artist and painter, committed the crimes. That he painted the pictures of the murder scenes in some of his paintings. That he was cold and evil. She apparently matched some of his stationery to letters that were sent to Scotland Yard. Of course, there were roughly 800 letters sent, most of which were frauds and people just trying to harass possibly Scotland Yard, and were interested in the case as he might have been himself. The She took some DNA samples from the letters. I believe they were inconclusive, as it's been over 100 years since the Jack the Ripper murders. And she just doesn't have much evidence. It doesn't seem. Nothing, not hard evidence. And then we have a fella, an amateur ripperologist, who, I think his name was Edwards, his last name, wrote a book and had come across at an auction a shawl that was found at the scene of one of the Jack the Ripper murders. And apparently one of the officers asked if he could take it home, which that would hopefully would be unheard of today in police work, but he thought his wife might like it since she was a seamstress or like to sew or something. I found that fascinating. But the shawl was covered in blood, and apparently she stuck it in a box or a crate or something in their house for over 100 years, and it came up for auction, and this guy Edwards bought it, and he got with a Finnish from Finland, a DNA scientist expert who uses a new type of DNA technology, something as opposed to vacuuming minute samples of any kind of DNA he can find and testing it. And apparently, the testing had the prostitute's DNA match from her ancestor and DNA from I guess he was a hairstylist, a beautician, or a Jewish guy, Aaron Kosminski, who also was identified by a Jewish man at the time of the murders as being near a scene of one of the murders. And once again, he apparently had syphilis or schizophrenia. It seemed the 19th century was rife with disease, syphilis, mental disorders. Well, I guess in this day and time people are too, but the very violent murderers, from anywhere from stranglers to slashers. So, if I was to if the case was open today and we were around, I would like to talk to Aaron Kosminski about at least the one murder, and then Mary Kelly's fisherman boyfriend about her murder, and I would have definitely incarcerated this Francis Tumblety, uh, Doctor Tumblety, or whatever his deal was, and questioned him thoroughly. He was pretty crafty, but I believe they could have got some information out of him if they would have really looked into him, or could have held on to him. But as far as Walter Sickert, Patricia Cornwell's theory, it's interesting, the letterhead, but he could have been one of the people that just wrote letters in. I believe Scotland Yard and the London Metropolitan Police did do a thorough investigation. I can't knock them. Uh, the, Supposedly they questioned, I believe they questioned 800 people. They also had either 100 or 200 actual suspects, and they were tailing people. They had theories. One thing I do want to point out, which is interesting in itself, is right the day before or the day after all this happened or started happening, two of the heads of, I forget which one, Scotland Yard or the London Metropolitan Police, they retired, and another guy just took off to France, just on vacation. I just found that interesting, and that would could possibly tie in with the Masons and the a royal conspiracy, or it could have just be a coincidence. Um, and then there's another prime suspect, which is interesting, is this Cross guy, Lemire. Uh, he supposedly found the body of one of the prostitutes. His name was Charles. He gave the name to the police, Charles Allen Cross. But his that was, I believe, one of his stepfather's names, but his name was actually Charles Allen Lechmere. Lechmere at and a he was a cartman that went on the same path for his job as, I guess, nearly all of the Whitechapel murders, all of the Jack the Ripper murders. And that night in particular, that prostitute was not mutilated completely. She was murdered, and another witness appeared, a Robert Paul. And I guess they somehow notified the night watchman or the police who was on that route on his beat, and but they never brought him in anymore for any more kind of questioning about it. And this guy, Charles Cross, had apparently 12 kids, but he lived with his mom at the time. And then I was thinking, possibly with 12 children in a poverty-stricken London full of disease, starvation, uh, crime-ridden, uh, prostitution run rampant. Um, I was thinking, well, possibly if he did do it, maybe he was robbing the prostitutes to try to feed his children. and uh, hence he stayed at his mom's and in between or something. Uh, but then that would he really need to mutilate them as horrible as what these women were mutilated? Uh, it doesn't really hold up like that. For him to do something like that when he could have just killed them quickly and robbed them, or even just knocked them out and robbed them. But a lot of people make something of that he lied, but at one time his name was Charles Allen Cross, and then they found out, uh, people found out later it was Charles Lechmere, Lechmere. Uh, so basically, there are so many theories, so many suspects. Who would think? I mean, at that time, there would be so many suspects. That just goes to show how dangerous the Victorian age was back then with these. And But if I would say possibly Aaron Kosminski. Um, it appears that that evidence. When they say the shawl that was found at the scene, the prostitute couldn't have owned because it was too fine of linen, too expensive. But then Kosminski, I guess he was a hairdresser. He was supposedly a poor Jewish guy. Uh, they say the DNA is inconclusive, but I've read other things that say it's pretty. It narrowed it down pretty well, and possibly someone gave the prostitute the shawl. Maybe it was Aaron's. Maybe he got it somehow. Or the wealthy Francis Tumblety, who hated women, hated prostitutes, had medical knowledge. Could it have been his? And the DNA evidence was inconclusive for Kosminski, but it was probably possibly Tumblety, Francis Tumblety. It is interesting. Or was it really a some wealthy doctor or a wealthy businessman? Like, and maybe if it was a woman's shawl, maybe it was the a woman was the Jack the Ripper, a wealthy woman who wanted to take it out on these women. Maybe her man was uh, running around with these women. But some apparently one of Walter Sickert's friends worked for him. Something. Some people around him thought he was Jack the Ripper, and I guess before Patricia Cornwell there was a Gene Overton Fuller who wrote, said that Sickert's friend or co-worker, Florence Posh, thought he was. There was a story that thought it was him. But what you got here, you've got H. Holmes with several aliases, a murder castle, an insurance fraudster, a stone cold killer, as proven from history already, and the crimes he committed, along with killing children. You have the Maybrick Diary, which is probably a forgery, false. Seems there be some question about it. You have DNA evidence of a shawl worn by a murdered prostitute, and had DNA, I guess, matching or closely matching a descendant of Aaron Kosminski. You have Prince Eddie, who they say had syphilis and was a deranged murderer. You know, I guess syphilis can cause mental illness. You've got this Carl Fagenbaum, or Zahn Fagenbaum, and he went by other aliases and names, who was a German merchant marine who could have been just traveling around the world at different times per Trevor Marriott, who was a murder squad detective with Scotland Yard. But Fagenbaum's own attorney apparently was not very truthful and never brought this out in a court of law or tried an insanity defense. After Fagenbaum supposedly told him whenever he was around women or certain women, he wanted to kill them and mutilate them. He had a raging desire to do so. Was the shawl? Did the shawl belong to the wife of Dr. Sir John Williams? Was it Lizzie Williams Shaw? Francis Tumblety, he fled. Scotland Yard was on to him. They had a man. They had him. They also had Aaron Kosminski, another Jewish gentleman who was a witness but would not testify because he did not want him to get the death penalty. I guess it was against their religion. So what you have here, what you have is you cannot have a police investigation. You cannot have when people don't cooperate or you don't pursue them, and sometimes the very laws that are meant to protect and to capture these people work in their favor, as maybe possibly with Tumblety, and he was clever enough to escape and supposedly had plenty of money. I still would like to know where he got all this money from. It just doesn't seem plausible. What was his line of business actually? Did people pay him that much for his herbal treatments? Was he selling body parts? He had body parts in his house. So, coming to the conclusion of my bit of research, what I call resolution from hell, it could have been different people, deranged people from anywhere from alcoholics to homicidal ex lovers to syphilis induced insanity, or just cold blooded, uh, a cold blooded person trained in the medical profession and possibly to buying and selling body parts. And uh, there's just to a angry wife who was barren, and then you could go all the way into all kinds of other theories with the royals and the masons. Um, but you have so many, so many suspects in the case. One, I believe it was Scotland Yard or police. He said this Michael Ostrong, or there was a Russian mad doctor. Uh, but I believe the investigation was far-reaching and wide. I mean, they interviewed apparently 800 suspects, or interviewed 800 people with 100 to 200 suspects. Patricia Cornwell has spent roughly, by her own admission, $6 million or 6 million British pounds on her investigation into Walter Sickert, but it's not conclusive. Uh, some of it is interesting, but there's something with that Cartman cross at the scene with the other guy. Could it have been both of them? Maybe one was keeping an eye out while the other one was doing whatever he was doing, or robbing these women, or there's some confusion whether they were what if there was sexual assault or there wasn't in certain cases. The shawl apparently had what I guess semen on it, and apparently when Aaron Kosminski was in the lunatic asylum, he they called it would abuse himself, which meant he would masturbate, and but he was never apparently supposedly violent in the facility, but maybe he didn't have the chance. Uh, so 1888, Jack the Ripper. Resolution from Hell. Your narrator is Joe Henry, and I'm looking at a couple different suspects, two, maybe even three, and from England to New York, possibly. Uh, I don't know that Jack the Ripper was one. It may have been Jack the Rippers, and possibly a Jane the Ripper, maybe one. Um, but it is an interesting case, and it is partly solved, but due to the times and the laws and the police were hampered apparently by the something that was scrolled, the Jewish something will not be blamed on the wall. The police, the head of the police, he had it washed off the wall. Apparently they were hampered politically. There was, I don't know what, communists and Zionists and the royal family and the political correctness. Even back then in 1888, they weren't allowed, or as far as I know, they didn't get any of their suspects and torture them or sleep deprive them or beat them for a confession or uh, um, one guy that was a did some murders around then, when right before he was hung, he said, "I am Jack." Well, what is that? And this Montague Druitt, they said he was sexually insane, but then he drowned himself in the Thames River. Um, so I don't know if that leads to guilt, but it is a sordid tale and one that will continue to fascinate the world and forensics and the police world. So keep working on it. Have a good time.